The year was 1410, and the air in the Beauvale Charterhouse was thick with the scent of parchment and ink. In the quiet of the scriptorium, a monk named Stephen sat hunched over a manuscript, his quill moving steadily across the page. The text he was copying was not for his fellow monks, but for a wider audience, men and women outside the cloistered walls. This manuscript, now known as Douce 114, contained the lives of visionary women and a letter from Saint Catherine of Siena, all translated into Middle English. Stephen's task was not just a translation. It was a delicate balancing act. The women whose stories he was copying, Elizabeth of Spalbeek, Christina mirabilis, Marie of Oignies, and Catherine of Siena, were known for their visions and mystical experiences. These were not ordinary texts. They were powerful, and in the wrong hands they could be dangerous. The Carthusian order, to which Stephen belonged, was known for its strict rules of silence and solitude. They were recluses, not preachers. Yet the explicit at the end of the manuscript, written by the self-described compiler, reveals a different audience. The compiler, recognizing his own limitations, humbly asks for forgiveness for any mistakes in his translation. He speaks not just to the learned men and clerks, but to all men and women who might read or hear the text. This suggests that the manuscript was intended for a lay audience, not just the monastic one. The inclusion of these women's visionary texts in a vernacular anthology was significant. In medieval England, such texts were rare. The few that existed were often viewed with suspicion, especially after the 1409 Lambeth Constitutions by Archbishop Arundel, which sought to regulate the translation and circulation of religious texts to prevent heresy. This climate of suspicion meant that translators and disseminators of vernacular religious texts were cautious, often seeking approval from ecclesiastical authorities. Despite the risks, the compiler of Douce 114 was not deterred. He carefully curated the manuscript, placing the lives of the visionary women at the center, with Stephen's letter serving as a bridge between them and the concluding text by Suso. The manuscript was a devotional anthology, a collection of texts intended to inspire and guide the faithful. The compiler's humility topos, where he acknowledges his own unworthiness and emphasizes that he was following orders, is a common rhetorical device. It serves to deflect any potential criticism and to emphasize the text's legitimacy. The manuscript's journey from the scriptorium to its final resting place in the Beauvale Charterhouse is a story of careful intention and unexpected outcomes. The compiler's explicit hints at a broader audience, suggesting that the manuscript may have circulated outside the monastery. This idea is supported by the model of shared books among lay readers, such as the Common Prophet books in London, which were commissioned and shared among a discrete group of laity. The lives of the visionary women in Douce 114 were not just stories. They were a window into a world of spiritual experiences that were both revered and feared. In medieval England, the tradition of effective piety, which focused on the human aspects of Christ and the Virgin Mary, was strong. However, the unmediated relationship with God that these visionary women described was rare and often met with skepticism. The tension between acceptance and suspicion is evident in the history of these texts. Some women, like Hildegard of Bingen, were celebrated as saints, while others, like Marguerite Porreet, were executed for heresy. The survival of Porreet's Mirror of Simple Souls in Middle English translation, though unattributed, suggests that even heretical texts could find a place in the devotional fabric of medieval England, albeit within the controlled environment of a monastic community. The manuscript Douce 114, with its collection of visionary texts, represents a unique moment in the history of medieval English devotional literature. It reflects the complex interplay of spiritual authority, textual transmission, and the cautious embrace of women's visionary experiences. The manuscript's presence in a devotional anthology speaks to the enduring power of these texts and the nuanced ways in which they were integrated into the devotional culture of the time. In medieval England, devotional literature often included accounts of visions, especially in hagiographic or meditative texts. However, narratives of contemporary visionary women were relatively scarce. Some English texts, like those by Richard Rolle, could be considered mystical, but they lacked the personal and immediate quality found in the lives of visionary women from the Low Countries, such as Marie of Oignies and Christina mirabilis. These women were part of the Devotio Moderna, a religious reform movement that emphasized ascetic and contemplative ideals. Although the movement was never condemned as heretical, it shared similarities with the Wycliffite philosophies in England, which were considered heretical. English readers were cautious about texts that did not fully align with orthodox beliefs. Kirby Fulton describes the range of responses to such texts, from official censorship to varying degrees of tolerance. The English reader's caution was particularly heightened when dealing with texts that had any association with heretical movements. The manuscript Douce 114, containing lives of visionary women, would likely have been met with grudging tolerance or even suspicion. Access to visionary literature often encouraged the practice of visions. Texts by or about women like Mechthild of Hackeborn, Bridget of Sweden, and Catherine of Siena were sometimes accompanied by reading directions that encouraged readers to follow the examples, but warned against actually practicing the vision. Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp are notable examples of English women who experienced visions. Kemp, in particular, was influenced by the lives of Marie of Oignies and Bridget of Sweden, whom she took as models. The manuscript Douce 114 is significant because it provides access to these visionary women's stories. The level of suspicion varied depending on the reader. Monastic readers, who were more likely to have the theological background to interpret such texts, were less cautious than lay readers, who were more open to misinterpretation. The Carthusian order, for example, interacted with these texts seriously and without a sense of subversion. A with M manuscript, containing a copy of Suso's Horologium, includes marginal notes that reference Catherine of Siena and Mechthild of Hackeborn, showing how these texts were interconnected for monastic readers. Stephen Maconi's letter in Douce 114, which follows the lives of 3 Beguine women, serves a specific purpose. Barry Windeat suggests that the placement of Catherine of Siena's life as the last in the collection is an endorsement of a kind of mystical contemplation encouraged among Carthusian readers. Maconi's letter, written with personal acquaintance and authenticity, updates the lives of the Beguines and makes them relevant to contemporary readers. Catherine's life, as presented in Maconi's letter, is more subdued compared to the ecstatic and physical devotion of the other Beguines. This presentation serves to validate the other women in the collection and to show that Catherine, despite her mystical qualities, could be a more approachable and less controversial figure. For Carthusian readers who were personally and professionally connected to the author, the text reinforces a sense of connection to the saint and her realness. Maconi's relationship with Catherine is deeply personal. He saw himself as her son, a sentiment reflected in Catherine's letters to his mother, Giovanna. Catherine encouraged Giovanna to accept Maconi's departure, framing it as a necessary step in his spiritual journey. In one letter, Catherine writes, "I want you, I beg you for the love of the slain lamb, to use this knowledge to assuage the grief and heartache you have felt because of Stephen's departure. Be glad, be happy, for this will surely make his soul and yours grow in grace." Maconi joined Catherine on her journey to Avignon in 1376, and she predicted that he would leave his family to join her group. In his letter, Maconi recalls this prediction and his decision to leave his family, emphasizing the spiritual family he found with Catherine. He writes, "I can find no greater desire in me than to be continually near you." This account underscores the theme of replacing a biological family with a spiritual one, a concept that would resonate with Carthusian readers, particularly novices and young monks. The letter's inclusion in Douce 114, a Carthusian manuscript, highlights the order's interest in Catherine and the Beguine women. The Carthusians, who were familiar with these texts, could see in Catherine a maternal figure and a model of spiritual leadership. Maconi's letter, with its personal and authoritative tone, would have provided a spiritual balm for Carthusian readers, offering them a maternal figure in a life that was otherwise devoid of such relationships. Catherine's canonization process was complex and faced significant obstacles, including the papal schism and the skepticism of theologians like Jean Gerson. Maconi's letter, originally written to a Dominican priest in Venice, was part of the evidence used to secure Catherine's canonization in 1461. The Middle English version in Douce 114 omits some of the formal context, but remains faithful to the spirit of Maconi's words. In this way, Maconi's letter not only validates Catherine's holiness, but also reinforces the Carthusian order's spiritual lineage and the importance of a new spiritual family. For the Carthusians, Catherine becomes a figure of maternal guidance and a model of spiritual devotion, bridging the gap between the earthly and the divine. Maconi's recollection of Catherine is not just about her mystical abilities, but about how she helped him understand his own desires and calling. Despite his initial reluctance, he felt a deep connection to her, confessing, "Soothly most byloud mater, I can find no greater desire in me than to be continually near you." This realization led him to follow her final request to join the Carthusian order, even though most of her followers were Dominicans. Catherine's influence was so strong that after her death, Maconi found a new desire to enter the Carthusian order, a decision he felt compelled to make, no matter what the world might say. Catherine's death was a significant moment for Maconi. She instructed him to join the Carthusian order, a strict and contemplative community, with a final, almost commanding, plea. Despite his initial lack of interest in monastic life, he felt a deep spiritual pull after her death. He writes, "For when she bade me of obedience of God that I shoulda go to the Charteous order, I desired not to enter that order or any other. But sithen she was gone to God, such desire was kindled in my heart to do that bidden." This transformation highlights the profound impact Catherine had on his life. Maconi's letter, written when he was 60 years old, reflects on his deep bond with Catherine. He credits her, after God and the Virgin Mary, for his spiritual growth. He shares intimate details of their relationship, noting that she loved him with a motherly charite, and that many of her other followers envied their close connection. This personal testimony not only validates Catherine's importance in his life, but also lends credibility to his account. For the Carthusian readers, Maconi's letter serves as both a spiritual guide and a personal narrative. It offers a mirror for young monks to see the kind of mentorship and spiritual direction they might seek. Maconi's choice to join the Carthusian order, despite his initial reluctance, is presented as a special calling, chosen by both Catherine and God. The letter emphasizes the role of female figures, like Catherine and the Virgin Mary, in a predominantly male monastic environment. Maconi's letter was part of a broader effort to support Catherine's canonization. It was written during a time when her sainthood was still in question, and he aimed to provide evidence of her divine inspiration and miracles. He describes her frequent states of deep prayer, where she would become stiff and unresponsive, as if her soul had left her body. He emphasizes the frequency and authenticity of these moments, stating, "I say not 100th or 1,000 sides, but Michael more oftener." One particularly vivid story involves a skeptical woman who tested Catherine's state of trance by pricking her feet with a needle. Catherine remained still, and later her feet ached and bled, proving the authenticity of her experience. This anecdote, while aimed at a male audience, also addresses potential doubters, especially women, who might question the legitimacy of Catherine's visions. Maconi concludes his letter by affirming the truth of his account, invoking the safety of his soul and the witness of the monks he leads. He emphasizes that he has nothing to gain by lying, and that his words are a genuine testimony to Catherine's holiness and the impact she had on his life. His letter, written decades after her death, remains a powerful testament to her influence and the deep bonds of faith and spirituality that she fostered. Stephen Maconi's letter, found in the Douce 114 manuscript, is a powerful document that seeks to validate Catherine of Siena's sainthood. Maconi, a respected figure, was aware that some people might doubt the truth of his account, thinking he might lie to help secure Catherine's canonization. He assures his readers that lying would put his own soul at risk, and that even if the goal is good such as Catherine's sainthood, it doesn't justify dishonesty or bad actions. To further confirm his honesty, Maconi mentions notaries, witnesses, and the use of his seal to authenticate the text. He even swears that he would place his hands in fire to prove the truth of his words, emphasizing the importance of his testimony. Maconi's strong emphasis on the truth was necessary because Catherine's canonization was highly contested. After the Great Schism, Catherine and Bridget of Sweden faced intense criticism from major theologians like Jean Gerson, who dismissed their visions as false and imaginary. Catherine needed the support of powerful men like Maconi and her confessor, Raymond of Capua, to achieve her sainthood. With the backing of the Carthusian and Dominican orders, Catherine's sainthood was eventually recognized, though this recognition came long after the deaths of her supporters. For the English readers of Douce 114, Maconi's repeated emphasis on witnesses and truth helps to validate the manuscript's contents. Maconi also addresses the perception of Catherine as too political and too outspoken. Her association with the Dominican Mantelletti, a group of lay women who were active in society, reinforced this image. However, for English readers who had no equivalent to the Mantelletti, this association might not have carried the same weight. Maconi balances this by focusing on Catherine's piety during her trip to Avignon to convince Pope Gregory XI to return to Rome. He describes her as a pious and virtuous servant of God, emphasizing her devotion rather than her political goals. Maconi draws on his position and experience to vouch for Catherine's holiness. He describes her as a perfect image of all virtues, a bright mirror of God's goodness, and a servant of God who surpasses many famous saints. This portrayal challenges any doubts about her gender and authority, presenting her as a passive recipient of God's grace rather than an active agent. Maconi's use of the term God's good men instead of servants of God in the English translation further gendered her virtue, emphasizing her role as a vessel of God's goodness. Maconi also highlights Catherine's deep commitment to confession, a sacrament that was particularly emphasized in England during the Wyclifite challenges. He recounts a miracle where Catherine knew a man's sins and convinced him to confess, demonstrating her close relationship with God and her profound impact on others. This story not only underscores the importance of confession, but also shows Catherine's ability to persuade and guide people, even when they are reluctant. Despite his efforts to focus on Catherine's piety, Maconi cannot entirely avoid her political and social significance. He describes an incident where 3 high-ranking advisors to the Pope, including an archbishop, came to challenge Catherine's worthiness to speak to the Pope. The advisors were not initially concerned with her visions, but were upset by her audacity as a vile little woman, speaking on political matters. They questioned her about her mystical experiences, and how she distinguished between good and evil spirits. Catherine, however, answered their questions with theological and intellectual depth, impressing even her confessor and the advisors. They left convinced of her meekness and enlightenment, validating her status as a teacher and theologian. The manuscript Douce 114, which includes Maconi's letter, was intended for multiple audiences. The original readers of Il Processo Castellano needed to be convinced of Catherine's sanctity. Lay readers, both men and women, had to understand her in the context of other visionary women, where her political activities balanced their extreme asceticism. The Carthusians of Beauvale Charterhouse read her visions as validated by her theological insights, which were examined and approved by the bishops and the Pope. This multifaceted approach to Catherine's story helped address the concerns and cultural anxieties of each audience. The English interest in Catherine's texts, including Maconi's letter, was influenced by political and religious factors. In the early 15th century, England was engaged in the 100 Years' War with France, and Catherine's role in moving the papacy from France to Rome aligned with English anti-French sentiment. Later, in the mid-15th century, after England's defeat in the war, the memory of Catherine's political success against the French may have further fueled interest in her text. Maconi's letter, along with other works like William Fleet's The Cleanness of Soul and Raymond of Capua's The Life of Saint Catherine of Siena, were disseminated and translated due to the strong male interest in Catherine's cult. These texts were compiled into broader devotional works, making them accessible to both monastic and lay readers. The early English interest in Catherine, established through Maconi's letter, set a precedent for the continued dissemination and translation of her works in the following centuries. The story of William Fleet and his influence on English spirituality, particularly through his relationship with Catherine of Siena, is a fascinating one. Fleet, an English friar who spent much of his life in Italy, played a significant role in shaping Catherine's spiritual development. His most important work, The Remedies Against Temptations, had a profound impact on late medieval English devotional literature and remains a key text in understanding the spiritual landscape of the time. Fleet's journey began at Cambridge University, where he was disillusioned by the academic world and the competitive nature of his peers. In 1357, he took a year off to reflect and write, eventually deciding to commit to a hermitic life. He moved to the Augustinian monastery of Lexito near Siena, Italy, where he met the young Catherine of Siena, who would later become a prominent figure in Christian history. Their relationship was deep and long-lasting. Fleet served as both an advisor and a confessor to Catherine, guiding her spiritual growth from a young age. Even though they did not meet often in person, their correspondence was intimate and influential. Catherine's theology, particularly her ideas on self-knowledge and the knowledge of God, was heavily influenced by Fleet's teachings. This is evident in her letters and in the way she described sin, using terms that echoed Augustine's philosophy, which Fleet had also embraced. Fleet's Remedies Against Temptations was a pivotal text in late medieval English spirituality. Despite being largely overlooked by modern scholars, it was widely copied and translated, appearing in over 40 manuscripts, most of which were of English origin. The text was so influential that it was often misattributed to other prominent figures like Walter Hilton and Richard Rolle. This widespread circulation and misattribution highlight the text's importance and its resonance with English readers. The Remedies was not just a static text. It evolved through various recensions and translations, each adding its own layers of meaning and interpretation. This fluidity allowed the text to become a foundational element of English devotional culture, influencing works by Walter Hilton, Thomas More, and even the 17th century mystic Augustine Baker. The text's ideas were integrated into numerous spiritual guides and sermons, making it a cornerstone of English spirituality from the 14th century through the Reformation. Catherine of Siena, through her interactions with Fleet, became a conduit for these ideas, bringing a distinctly English flavor to her teachings and writings. Her texts, such as The Cleanness of Soul and Il Dialogo, reflect the Augustinian and Fletian influence, making her a significant figure in the English devotional tradition. Her English connection, facilitated by Fleet, allowed her to resonate with a broader audience in England, where she was not just a foreign saint, but a familiar and inspiring figure. In summary, William Fleet's Remedies Against Temptations and his relationship with Catherine of Siena played a crucial role in shaping the spiritual landscape of late medieval England. Through his writings and his guidance of Catherine, Fleet's ideas became deeply embedded in English devotional literature, influencing generations of spiritual seekers and leaving a lasting legacy.